Sid Meier, the designer behind the incredibly popular and influential Civilization game series, once described games as a series of interesting decisions. In fact, it's the ability to make choices that separates games from a less interactive form of media such as a movie or a book. Whether it's the choice whether to shield or grab, or the decision of which set of armor you're going to wear, the choices you make help define games and the gaming experience. While this description doesn't necessarily hold true for all sorts of games, many rhythm games, for example, are simply about executing a series of actions without a lot of interesting decisions. It's a good mindset to have when designing a large variety of different types of games. The choices you present your player with in a real-time strategy game are going to be very different from those in a turn-based RPG, but in both instances it's very important to make sure that you're always presenting your player with a series of interesting decisions. Today, I want to take a look at what makes a decision interesting and how you can add interesting decisions to your games. When I think about interesting decisions in games, a few things jump to mind. First, the decision has to have consequences. If you know that everything is going to turn out exactly the same regardless of which choice you make, then the decision doesn't really matter one way or the other. I believe this is what turned off a lot of players from the Telltale style of games. These games are very narrative focused and appear to give players control over the story. However, due to the episodic nature of these games, they couldn't actually allow players to veer very far off of the storyline that they were trying to tell. In my personal experience, I initially believed that my choices were going to have an effect on the plotline going forward. Once I realized that none of the decisions I made were actually going to affect the narrative, I began to lose interest in the games entirely. Second, the player needs to be able to predict the outcome of the decision, at least to some extent. It's not enough to know that your decision will have some effect, you need to have some inkling of what that outcome will be. If you've ever read an old choose-your-own-adventure book, then you have some idea of how unpredictable they can be. They might present you with a fork in the road and ask you whether you want to go left or right. If you go left, you'll be eaten by alligators. If you go right, you might get to marry a princess. You never really know what's going to happen at any given turn. With these books, the unpredictability was part of the appeal because the stories were relatively short, and if you made the wrong decision, you could easily go back and make the opposite choice. With games, this doesn't really hold true. Unless unpredictability is designed as one of the core appeals of the game, providing the player with choices where they have no ability to predict the outcome can be very frustrating and can just feel like a waste of time. I think this is a problem with a lot of games that provide dialogue trees. Sometimes they'll present you with a series of simple dialogue choices that don't really tell you a lot about how your character is actually going to respond. The options might be aggressive, sarcastic, or agreement, which don't really give you enough information to predict what the outcome of your response is going to be. Finally, in order to really be an interesting decision, the choice should not be obvious. Suppose you're playing a turn-based RPG and have two attack options. One of them, we'll call it Big Burn, costs 2 magic and does 10 fire damage. The other one, which we'll call Bad Burn, costs 3 magic and does 5 fire damage. Your choice definitely matters. Depending on what you choose, you'll spend different amounts of magic and do different amounts of damage. You also are easily able to predict the outcome of your choice. However, this is not a very interesting decision because there's really no reason to ever choose Bad Burn. Big Burn costs less and does twice as much damage. Bad Burn is a very obviously obsolete and suboptimal choice. Another important aspect of designing interesting choices is knowing when and where to provide your player with choices. Even if your decisions meet all of the 3 criteria we just talked about, it doesn't always mean that providing more choices is always better. For example, if you provide your player with too many choices, or the outcomes of these decisions are too complicated, this can result in a situation known as analysis paralysis. Analysis paralysis is a situation where one player spends way too much time attempting to make a decision. Most players, especially competitive gamers, want to make the best decision that they possibly can, and will take all the information that they have available to them into account when making their choice. If there are too many options or too much information to process, this can slow down the entire decision-making process and grind the entire game to a halt. While this may not be as big of an issue in single-player games, it can be a huge problem in multiplayer games. The lesson here is that even if your decisions are interesting, if they get in the way of enjoying the game, they should be simplified or removed. Another problem that can occur with too many choices is the paradox of choice. This is an idea proposed by psychologist Barry Schwartz that claims that when you're given more options, sometimes you can actually be less satisfied with the outcome of your choice. There are several reasons for this. The first is what's known as opportunity costs, or the regret over what you could have chosen instead. When you have too many options, no matter what the outcome, it's easy to believe you could have chosen another option that would have been even better. This can cause you to be less satisfied with your choice than if you had fewer or no options at all. Imagine you're at an ice cream shop. If that shop has 3 different flavors of ice cream, it would probably be pretty easy for you to choose your favorite, perhaps vanilla, and you'd be reasonably satisfied with your choice. On the other hand, suppose it had 20 flavors instead. Not just chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry, but many other flavors of ice cream as well. It might take you a while to finally settle on mint chocolate chip, but as you're eating, you're not as satisfied because you're thinking about, what if I would have chosen cookie dough instead? Even if your overall experience is better because you're able to choose a better flavor with 20 options than with 3, you might end up less satisfied because of the thought of what might have been. Another reason for the paradox of choice is the idea of blame. When you make a bad decision, it can sometimes feel like you have nobody to blame but yourself. This can often occur when there's too much available information for somebody to truly process it all. When you make a bad move because you forgot about a little piece of information, it can be really easy to blame yourself. But if these sorts of misplays occurred very frequently in a particular game, it's probably because the designer was presenting too much information at once and creating an overly complicated game state. For an example of this situation, let's look at Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering is an incredibly complicated game, and one of the most complicated parts of it is the combat system. When you get into a situation where both you and your opponent have a bunch of different creatures on the board, it can be really difficult to decide how you want to attack. You have to take into account all the different ways your opponent could block, and keep in mind the different sorts of cards they might have in their hand that they could use to stop you. When going through these calculations, it's easy to forget about a particular card on the board that has an ability that might totally change the way the combat could play out. This can lead to feel-bad moments where the player feels dumb for not paying attention to that particular ability, and Magic R&D specifically keeps an eye out to try to prevent these sorts of situations from happening too frequently. The final reason for this paradox of choice is a raise in expectations. When you have more options, you naturally have higher expectations for the outcome of what you choose. The more options that are available for a specific choice, the more likely it is that you're going to find something that perfectly meets your needs, and the less likely you are to accept anything less than perfection. This can lead to dissatisfaction when, after choosing from a wide range of options, the one that you end up picking still isn't absolutely perfect. 200 years ago, if your shoes were around the right size and roughly foot-shaped, you'd probably be perfectly happy. These days, however, there are so many options that finding the perfect shoe can seem impossible. With so many options, you want a shoe that's stylish but comfortable, lightweight but supportive, solid but flexible, that keeps your feet warm without making them too sweaty. With more choices comes drastically higher expectations, and when you can't find a shoe that perfectly meets your needs, it's only natural to be dissatisfied. Keep in mind, I'm not trying to say that choices are bad. Far from it. I'm only trying to say that more choices isn't always better. These consequences I've been talking about, analysis paralysis and the paradox of choice, only occur when the player is overwhelmed with too many options. Interesting choices are one of the best things about games, but it can be taken too far. Choosing between 3 different starter Pokemon at the beginning of the game is a fun and interesting choice, Having to choose between 50 different options, on the other hand, would be an absolute nightmare. There is, however, one situation where adding even a simple choice could detract from your game, and that's the situation where the outcome of the choice rarely matters, or one option is chosen an overwhelming majority of the time. In Digital Magic, whenever a player needs to make a decision, it requires them to click one of the options, and this can become incredibly annoying when the player is overwhelmed with too many clicks. Suppose there were a card that says, "You may have target player draw 3 cards." Because this card uses the word may, it gives the player a choice of whether they even want to use the ability or not. However, while there may be rare situations where the player would choose not to use this ability, such as if they're almost out of cards in their deck, the player's almost always going to say yes to this option, which makes the extra click unnecessary. The card also says target player, which means that the player is going to have an extra click to decide which player gets to draw. While this might be a bit more controversial because there are definitely situations where you'd want your opponent to draw, these situations are very rare and almost always you're going to choose to draw the cards yourself. While the way the card is written gives the player more choices, it probably would have a better user experience if the card simply said, "You draw 3 cards," without giving the player unnecessary options. As you can see, designing interesting choices in your games is not as simple as it may sound. However, by following these simple rules and paying attention to these pitfalls, we can all add more interesting decisions to our games that help bring them to the next level. That's all I have for this week. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content every couple weeks. If you want to see more, check out my other videos, like my Halloween special on the history of the tarot deck. I also have over 100 articles on the Rempton Games blog, which you can check out at the link in the description down below. And join me next time for a very unique look at the design of levels in Mario Maker 2. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.